first of all, of course, how did you end up here? I mean, you said you grew up here in Los Angeles, but what got you into music? I mean, I understand you had a lot to do with the whole technical stuff like MIDI and all that, but what got you into this whole field of music?
Well, it certainly wasn't what I was thinking about growing up. I was actually studying art and photography, and my real plan was really to go into something related to the arts. And I had one uncle who was a very gifted and very successful painter from Hungary, and another uncle who was a very successful photographer, also from Hungary, which is where my family, my parents are from.
I never knew that.
In fact, my brother was born in Ulm, Germany.
In Ulm?
My older brother, but came here as an infant, and I came much later.
Nice.
You know, I always was interested in music. I was playing woodwind, playing flute, and having my own bands. But you know, I like taking apart things, radios and amplifiers and crossing wires and making crazy feedback. And then after I finished gymnasium, after I finished school, I started to find myself exposed to more and more elements of modern electronic music. I learned synthesizers. Actually, I was given on a loan. I was given by Randy Kerber an ARP 2600 synthesizer like that one. It's not that one, but he was going on tour with. He was touring with some, like Michael Jackson, or he was touring with some major artist. He said, "Look, I'm going to be on the road for like 6 months. Why don't you just take it and play with it?"
Yeah, why not?
Because I really wanted to learn. And also, I was learning about digital synthesis, which was very new back then and only was existing like in university.
Right.
But I was absorbing everything, and I was starting to write. And then a rocket scientist and I met, and he taught me programming. He taught me how to write code that could make a computer improvise. And so, you know, teaching it rules, and that got me to do a TED Talk about it, the second TED conference, right, when they were starting, and talking about the relationship of technology and music when it was exploding. And then, you know, for a few years, for almost 4 years, I got a job. I had already started writing music, and it was all experimental, and I was working with choreographers and dancers and artists and galleries and museums and just doing installations of ambient sound, and some with electronics and some more like musique concrète, and chopping up tape and sampling and advanced algorithmic synthesis, and so all this crazy stuff. And I met somebody at the Roland company in the mid '80s. This is going back. I was young, you know. And in the '80s, somebody at Roland said, "We've heard about you. You can write software." Now, I don't really write software. I could write code to improvise music on these special computers, but I said I needed some money. I was tired of trying to make a living playing, you know, teaching lessons and accompanying dancers, and, you know, I was getting tired of that. So I got this job working at Roland, and like 2 months later, this group of Japanese engineers walks into my little room, which was almost like a closet, really.
Right.
And they said, "You know, we know you're doing all these other things and working on control voltage sequencing with personal computers, but voltages to, you know, for modular synthesis." And they said, "But we want you to stop all of that, and we have something new, and we want you to just devote all your time to this thing, and we're calling it MIDI." And so they put down these two pianos, two electric, you know, two digital pianos with a MIDI plug, and it was the first one in the country.
Like you've seen it for the first time then?
Everybody. It didn't.
Right.
The MIDI was not released yet. This was the year before.
Right.
And from that point, I devoted my time, for the rest of my time, was not only to helping Roland develop MIDI products, you know, computer interfaces, the very first computer MIDI interface. I was also working with them on some of their early samplers and synthesizers, helping do some design work. because I was the only musician, and I knew sampling, and I knew the orchestra, because I'd already been writing and having pieces played a little bit. And so, for the next many years, even after I left Roland, I quit Roland. I couldn't stand it anymore because I wanted to compose, and I wanted to work on music. I wanted to be creative in music, and writing code, if you've ever written code, it taps the same part of your brain. So I'd come home at night, and I didn't want to write music after I'd written computer code, because really they feel similar, but they have a different outcome. I started meeting all of these composers who were interested in what I was doing, because I knew sampling, I knew sequencing, I was good at it. So I became kind of a studio guy for a few years. Right. But most of my clients were film composers. And from there, doing sound design and synthesis and drum programming, and some albums and pop albums and R&B albums, but mostly all film and TV.
Film. That's how you got in. Yeah.
And then ghosting, and then eventually, a few composers said, "Hey, there's a project and I don't have time. You do it, and I'll just let them. You just do it." So my career started because I was already working on big movies and TV shows, and working with Hans Zimmer, of course, for 8 years. Starting off doing programming, but very quickly he had me writing things, and then he recommended me for some films and TV, and it went very well, and I just kept doing that, and then would help him out on, I don't know, maybe 10 movies of his, while I was doing my own TV shows and movies. Wow. And then it was time for me to kind of just do my own thing, and I needed more space, so I set up my own studio, and I've been doing that ever since.
So do you occasionally work for anyone else anymore, or is it just you?
A little bit, not much. Every so often, I've helped a few friends out. Cliff Martinez and I go way back.
It figures.
So actually we just worked on 3 things last year, but we hadn't done anything for 5 years before that. Wow. So every so often something pops up. But he and I think we think alike in some ways. Right. I understand his music. He understands my music and my process and his process. So he's doing great, and so I've helped him out, but no, other than that, no. So that's what I've been doing, is movies and TV shows and video games, and then I also own a music a library music company.
Oh, you do?
Called Liquid Cinema. Mm-hmm. And Liquid Cinema, I've been doing it about 6-7 years, and I work with an amazing group of composers who work with me to write music that we put out through many different companies around the world for licensing, because it's a big deal. And then also more recently, I've started a software, a synthesis company, and we just released our first product just a month and a half ago, called Orbit. But we have a company called Wide Blue Sound. I'm good friends with some of the people at Native Instruments, and every time I do a project, there's a part of the process that's all sound design. Mm-hmm. I'll spend time sampling and building instruments, either in EXS for Logic or Contact, and more Contact lately. Mm-hmm. And so I've just developed a big set of sounds, and one idea that somebody had suggested was, well, why don't you build a really cool Contact instrument? But that wouldn't work. I wasn't interested. But what I was interested was to build an instrument. And I have a partner here at the studio who took on a big role in helping me develop our first instrument, this thing we call Orbit. And Orbit uses an idea that came to me very quickly as part of how I kind of think about sound anyway, right, which is a little hard to describe, but it involves sort of a very certain kind of rotating between sounds. It's not exactly morphing, it's sort of crossfading, but not really. But it was an algorithm that I could build inside of Contact, yeah. And I built it, and then instead of using samples, it uses what I'll call performances. So you could press a note, and it would either do like an ambient sound, or it could do different kinds of rhythms.
Right.
And you could press a note, and a week later, it still wouldn't repeat.
Wow. So that is Orbit.
And that's Orbit, and that just in the last couple of months.
It just came out, right?
Just came out about 6 weeks ago.
Let's talk some of our users are very interested in your thoughts about some certain projects, like Chicago Home came out.
Yeah.
Like there was a lot of solo instruments in there, Celtic stuff and all that. How did you like that?
That was one of the very first things. It wasn't the very first thing I ever did, but it was very close. It was very, very early in my career. I had been working with Mark Isham.
Yes.
And he wrote the theme. And he said, these are really great people. I have another project to do. Why don't you just take this series? And so for 4 years, I did this show. It ran, I think, for 7 or 8 years altogether, but I did the first 4.
Yeah.
I always love stories. To me, the best stories are ordinary people in extraordinary situations. And that particular show was very much that.
Uh-huh.
So
it really spoke.
I think I don't know why exactly. It seems like so much of TV is either doctors or police. Why is that?
Now that you say it.
Like how much of TV is either police or detectives or doctors? So much. I think it's because these are people who get put into the worst circumstances. They're either trying to save lives or catch bad guys. And we're very drawn to these stories because the clock is ticking, both for doctors and police. And I've done both. I've done police, I've done doctors. So, and thank God I've done other things too. But I think the reason that they're so closely connected is because the clock is ticking, and if they don't do their job, somebody will die. So I only wanted to focus on what they were thinking. That's what music is a little bit about. It's the words are on the outside, and the music is sort of the inside. And that's very true in musicals, If you think about live musicals or musicals in films, the minute they start singing, time has stopped. Nobody else actually hears what they're saying.
Right.
It's them singing in a way to themselves.
That moment.
Not always. I mean, sometimes there's a love duet. But often, a song is when somebody stops to say what's going on inside of them. But in a way, that really has a link to why there's music in stories.
Right.
Why you almost never see a movie or TV project or video game without music. It's so rare. And usually it's very experimental. And that's because we see the action, we see the gun, or we see, whatever we see, and we hear the words, and we know what they're saying. But the music really tells us what they're feeling.
Right.
It's really kind of their internal experience.
To translate your feelings, or to translate whatever you feel for the person in that story on the screen, to translate that into music, was that always easy for you because you just felt it and know how to just?
I don't know that it's easy for anybody, but you have to remember that a composer is a part of a group led by a director or a producer, typically a director. In a way, there are really very few stories. There's the hero, there's the boy meets girl. There's a few kinds of stories,
Right.
but what's different about them is how the story is told, and maybe a few details, So, because great storytelling is a little bit about what the story is, but mostly about how the story is told, there is a group of people who will decide what is the style of this movie? What is the experience that we're trying to create for the audience? Which is great. It's fantastic. And I may have very strong feelings about a score, that it should be strings or piano or electronics or beats or ambience or dissonant or melodic. I have, you know, I'm a musician, so I have a set of tools at my disposal that create emotions, that create experiences. So with those tools, I can come to this movie and the director will say, well, I really love that. You know, I love guitar. I love strings. I love Grieg. I love Dead Mouse. I love, and you go, well, why? What is it you love about that? You know, well, I like how the music is slow, but it still feels nervous. I love that it's fast, but it still feels smooth. And with that, you can start to build a conversation between you and the filmmaker.
Right, that's what it's about.
You know, I mean, I'm a filmmaker, but I work with and for another filmmaker. And together we create a vision. And then my job is to fulfill that vision, but with what I do best, in the way that I think will work, using my experience and my intuition and my ability to be experimental and to be open-minded. I can play a piece of music and the director can go, that's not what I was thinking. You know, I think maybe you could be a little darker, or maybe it's a little too dark for the beginning of the movie. Why don't we take that and make that for later in the movie? You know, or hey, you know that I saw that weird instrument in your studio. I would love to hear that. You know, and I, you know, have all these weird instruments.
Right.
So the part of my process isn't to decide what the music should be, but it's to have a dialogue, a conversation with the filmmakers, and together come up with the one true best answer of what will this music be. And to go back to your question with Chicago Hope, you know, the budget was very low. I couldn't have an orchestra. I had maybe 8 or 10 musicians a week, mostly all strings and cellos, and there was a trumpet player, there was an acoustic guitar, you know, nylon's acoustic guitar player, saxophone, there was a soprano saxophone, which to me was like kind of oboe. It's the same range as oboe, but a little more. I just liked that. I liked that it was a little different because I think we hear a little too much oboe sometimes in films. My goal, and with the producer's permission, was to do something that was a little bit unusual. That there was things like these Celtic, you know, instruments, even though there's nothing Celtic in the show,
Right.
and you know, to make the score intimate, because the best moments were the very quiet, intimate moments where these ordinary people in unusual circumstances could express problems and doubts and worries. And it was a way to keep away from becoming a soap opera. You know, eventually drama sometimes becomes over-drama.
Right.
And so, yes, of course, in that show there were emergencies, and yes, I wrote music to say there's an emergency. But that emergency was always about the stars of the show, the characters, not so much the people who might live or die, but what it would feel like if you did your best, but somebody died anyway.
Well, yeah.
You know, that's much more interesting.
It is.
And I just created a little vocabulary, a language of instruments and themes that to me expressed that in a way that they were very happy.
Like a template you can use, like
A template of colors and of ideas.
Right.
Themes, you know, themes can be, depending on who you work with, like on that project, they love themes.
Good.
You know, not everybody does. Modern film, modern television especially, and less with games or films. Modern television, they get a little nervous about too much theme, too much melody. They want music that's more just a feel. That's sort of a trend right now. It's not bad. You know, it still works. It all works if you do it right.
Of course it does, yeah.
You know, it's just a creative choice, one of many. When you go to the movies, or you watch something on TV or online, or you play a game, you have to remember that every note you hear was approved by somebody other than the composer.
Right.
The composer doesn't get to say, I'm done. The composer says, here it is, what do you think?
Right.
And then somebody else will say, I like it, I don't like it, I like this part, but I don't like that part. And by the time it makes it, somebody else said, I like it. When I'm sitting here in my studio and I'm composing, what's coming is mine. Until I hit stop. And I send it to the person who's hired me, who's paying me.
Right.
Because from that point forward, I have put all my passion into my ideas. But when I hit stop record, and then I send that music to the, you know, or the when the director comes over, or we call it, whatever it is, they listen to it. It's not my music. It's their music. And if they say, I love it, that's the best
Right.
feeling in the world.
Right.
The best feeling in the world. And if once you make the decision, and you're lucky enough to be a professional,
Right.
you can't take anything personally. There is no my music,
Exactly. Yeah.
except while you're writing it. At which point, yes, it's music. It comes from inside. You know, of course it's going to be personal. It comes from inside.
Yeah.
Even if you're asked to write a tango or a weird hip-hop piece, it doesn't matter. It's still coming from inside of you. Of course it's personal.
Yeah.
But then after that, the rest of the process is, don't take it personally. I've had people, you know, yell at me, you know, about it. You know what? They were having a bad day. You know, they got into a fight with their, you know, wife that morning, and so they come over, and you know, I'm the guy in the room.
Yeah.
You know what? I take it all in stride. I try not to smile, but I don't let it get to me.
That's great. Songs of the Sea.
Oh, Songs of the Sea. You know, that's the music I wrote for the 2008 Olympics, and which were in Beijing, China. But as every Olympics has the main Olympics, but also has ocean Olympics. You know, sailing and kayak. I mean, you know, this kind of and the you know, and it's huge.
Right.
I mean, it has a massive audience, and I happened to be in China the year before. I was asked to come out and look at some of the recording studios and meet the musicians, because there was a group of people who were interested in providing services of orchestra and studio to film composers, like you have in Prague or Bratislava or London or Sofia or Budapest. And so they had a question, which is, are we at a high enough level to, you know, in terms of technology and microphones and equipment and studio space and orchestras? And so I got invited to go with an engineer and a couple other people to take a little tour of recording studios and orchestras in Beijing. And we had a little chance meeting with a conductor who had been given the task of figuring out what the music for all of the regattas, all the ocean events for the Olympics was, because his orchestra was in the city where where the Olympics were going to take place for all the boats.
Right.
And it's the city it's called Qingdao, but that's where Tsingtao beer comes from, which is a popular beer in all the Chinese restaurants in the United States. They all have this beer that comes from this city, but it's actually one of the oldest cities built by Germans.
Look at that.
Germany briefly had a lot of people there, and they wanted to build it. It was built by the Belgians and the Germans. And when you drive through Qingdao, China, it actually looks like a little seaside European, resort spa kind of area. It's
Go there.
it's not a big city, but it's not a small city.
Right.
But it's also one of the oldest cities. That is, that's where, parts of Buddhism came from this part of China. And so it's this interesting, very European city, which made it, I think, why they wanted to use this city, plus it's on the ocean. Beijing isn't. So they did an amazing job, and it was a really big thing. So this conductor was part of one of the people I met, and we started talking, and then that introduced me to some of the big film composers in China. Zhao Zhiping, who's sort of like the Ennio Morricone of China,
Oh, really?
the guy who did Raise the Red Lantern and Farewell My Concubine, some of the classic Chinese films of the last 30, 40 years. Anyway, his son was one of the music directors of the Olympics, and then it just all worked. And they wanted something that was part spectacle, part epic. They wanted a sound that felt kind of Western and Hollywood. But we ended up doing something a little more eclectic.
Yeah.
So there's big pieces and quiet pieces. There's a poem. There's a song, sung by a soprano. There's a violin. There's actually like a one-movement violin concerto that I wrote for the concertmaster, and him. And then there was also a piece for oboe and orchestra, very quiet piece. And there's actually a couple of pieces that I didn't put on the record.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was the big actually I didn't put the finale on there. No, because I wasn't happy with the recording. It was one of the hardest pieces of music I've ever written. For orchestra, and so it was. I was in China 5 times in 1 year, going back and forth to plan and record, and we recorded the album there, and then we did a tour. We did a 5-city concert tour with 2 orchestras, put together. So we did some in Beijing and Hong Kong and Shanghai and this little town, and it was crazy. It was a great experience,
Right.
And then I left. I got out of China 1 day before 2 days before the big
Before
opening
the
the opening ceremony for the main Olympics.
Right.
At which point, all the hotels raised their rates by 1,000%.
Really? 1,000%?
Yeah,
Wow.
every
Well,
hotel
okay.
and restaurant. So, but while I was there,
But
It was-
what's on your bucket list? What would you like to do?
Oh. creatively,
Is there
so many things.
Good.
I'm going to start doing some live performances. I'm going to be in Cologne in late August at Soundtrack Cologne, doing my first live concert in a long time. That might turn into a little tour.
Nice.
I have some other ideas about doing some live things, not me performing, but like musical ideas for theater, and I'm very interested in that. I have some other things involving not just music, but other things in film.
Awesome.
So everything kind of leads to something. You never know what's going to be around the corner. Anybody who's predicted the rest of their life is wrong, unless you're terminally ill.